very, very young people are tremendously creative because they push back a lot. Young people are phenomenally creative, and in part they're creative because they don't accept anything.
Who's more creative, young people or middle-aged people or old people?
It's interesting. So young people, and I'm thinking especially about kids, because I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, they are phenomenally creative, and in part they're creative because they don't accept anything. They're curious about everything. My kids will not ask a question without a follow-up or 5 or 10 or 20 follow-ups, right? Nothing is okay until we've explored it to the ends of the earth, and that's amazing, and that's why kids learn so much so quickly. They take nothing for granted. There's no such thing as common wisdom to a kid, right? You can say everyone does it this way, and they'll be like, why? But you say that to an adult, most of us say, oh, okay. We assume that what's the done thing, the way the herd is behaving is that way for a reason, even though often it's just accidental or it's just the easiest thing or whatever. And so I think very, very young people are tremendously creative because they push back a lot. But one of the really interesting things for me in this book is that I found people from young adulthood all the way through to very old adulthood, very later in their lives, who are experimentalists by nature. They take nothing for granted and they constantly question. And so they are way more creative because they ask more questions. But then they say, okay, so here are 10 options. How do I know which one's the best? I'm going to inhabit each one for 2 months, and then, in 2 years, I'll know the answer. And they do this serially. And some of them become Olympic athletes, even if they don't physically have the stature for it, because they're so good at finding new techniques. I talk about one of them in the book. Some of them become business titans because they say that everyone else is doing this thing and assuming it's right. Here's a different thing that's way better. And I know that because I've tried all the other options. And they end up being really successful because that curiosity that you have in childhood, when you carry it over into adulthood, it's kind of like a superpower. And so I think it's more about the questions you ask than your age.
I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the things I constantly am trying to figure out how to get my team. When you said to me that there's a certain type of person that just continues to keep asking why is the age, I was like, can you introduce me?
Yeah.
Because I'd love to hire them, because that's exactly, you think about what innovation is at its core, and it's that kind of rejection of convention, and that harder road, which is to try and reason up from first principles per se. You mentioned an athlete. Who are you referring to?
It's this athlete named Dave Burkhoff. He was an Olympic athlete in the 1988 and 92 games, 88 in Seoul and 92 in Barcelona. He's a backstroke swimmer. He swims the 100-meter backstroke and then some of the medley races. And I spoke to him for a while on the phone to understand his experiences, because he doesn't look like a lot of other backstroke swimmers. They tend to be very, very tall. The average world record holder is 6'3" to 6'4", so quite tall. He's about 5'10", which is a big difference in professional avenues if you're thinking about Olympic athletes. And when he was a student in the mid-'80s, he was at Harvard, which is not a place you really go if you're going to be a champion swimmer. It's a place you go for intellectual experiences, but it's not the best athletic school, generally speaking. But he had a coach there who encouraged him to be curious, to ask a lot of questions. And Burkhoff was naturally like this. So he would say to his coach, why do I need to swim that way? Like, why don't I try like 10 other ways to swim? Let's tweak my technique in all these different ways and see what works best. And what he ended up doing was he discovered that you swim about 88% faster when you're fully submerged under the water than when half of your body is above the water and half is below, which makes total sense from a physics perspective. But most backstroke swimmers, the way they swim is they push off the wall, and the minute they do that, their body starts to fight for oxygen because they're under the water. And so your instinct is to pop up as quickly as possible. But if you can train yourself to deal with the oxygen deprivation, you stay underwater for longer and you swim much faster. So Burkhoff developed this technique called the Burkhoff blast-off, it was known as, where he would swim underwater for the first 40 meters of a 100-meter race. So 40% of the race, almost a full lap of the Olympic pool. And then he would come up for air and then he would keep swimming. And he broke world records. He wasn't the best swimmer in terms of his physique, but he was the best swimmer strategically. And he had spent years experimenting to find this technique. And then, of course, all the other athletes saw the same thing and they started doing the same thing. And so it became more competitive. But in the interim, he won gold medals at 2 Olympic Games. He won a bronze. He was the world record holder multiple times. So, that questioning led someone who, in certain respects, at least physically, shouldn't have been the world record holder to be just that.